to ask about something that has been called the elephant in the room in your criminal justice reform, namely the failure to address mandatory minimum penalties. As you know, call to action number 32 in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report called on you to amend the criminal code to allow trial judges, upon giving reasons, to depart from mandatory minimum sentences and restrictions on the use of conditional sentences. It pointed out that that would assist in particularly addressing the specific needs of Indigenous offenders. Indeed, to my astonishment, the Correctional Investigator of Canada last year stated that although the First Nation population of Canada is about 5%, over one quarter of prisoners are Indigenous, and in respect of Indigenous women, over 1/3 of our incarcerated Canadians are Indigenous, and it was suggested that to address mandatory minimums would have a very positive effect on what I call the crisis of overrepresentation. So today I had a press conference with my colleague, Member of Parliament Sherry Benson, who tabled Private Member's Bill C-407, similar, by the way, to Senator Kim Pate's recently tabled Bill S-251. I should add that that bill was prompted by high school students from Saskatoon who chose this important measure as their primary suggested change in Canadian law. And in the audience today, I recognize Brody Boker and Camilo Silva, who drafted that bill, helped in drafting that important measure. Lastly, Minister, it was reported that over 2/3 of all charter challenges in the courts, 256 charter challenges that were in the courts are mandatory minimum sentence challenges. Imagine how much time and money that's taking to address that issue alone. Now, Minister, you came to office and almost 2 years ago, you promised in a Globe and Mail article in November that, quote, new legislation on mandatory minimums is coming soon, certainly in the early part of next year, close quote. That was early part of last year. So my question to you is, will you be moving forward in a timely way with your commitment to address this crisis in over-incarceration of Indigenous Canadians by way of fixing the mandatory minimums? And will you commit today to adopt the bills that I referenced earlier, Private Member's Bill C-407, Senate Bill S-251, or perhaps include them in C-75 so we can address this important issue?
Well, thank you for all of the questions and the comments. And I would start, Mr. Chair, and to my colleague, by recognizing that I agree with you that there is a crisis in terms of overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples and other marginalized Canadians in the criminal justice system, and we need to do all we can to ensure that we address that overrepresentation. As the member knows, we've taken many steps. The introduction of Bill C-75 was one of those steps in terms of how we approach administration of justice offences, how we look at bail reform, and having regard to Indigenous peoples in terms of bail and administration of justice. But I hear the question that has been asked in terms of mandatory minimum penalties, and I would first of all say that I applaud Brody and others in the audience for getting involved and engaged in discussions around how we can improve the criminal justice system. With respect to mandatory minimum penalties, I am continuing to ensure that we look at sentencing and sentencing reform. Mandatory minimum penalties is not within Bill C-75. I wanted to proceed as expeditiously as possible to ensure that I introduced a bill that would tackle the delays in the criminal justice system. That's not to say that looking at sentencing reform, including mandatory minimum penalties, is not important, because it absolutely is. And as the member said, I've been very clear in terms of where I am at and my views with respect to mandatory minimum penalties, my views that judges certainly should be provided the necessary discretion to impose sentences appropriate to the offender in front of them. Having said that, we need to ensure that we are going to be putting in place sentencing reform that will stand the test of time. As the member has indicated, mandatory minimum penalties are being litigated quite extensively. There are cases wherein the Supreme Court has upheld a mandatory minimum penalty, and there are cases where they have not. I want to ensure that I've taken all possible steps and diligence as we continue to be focused on our commitment around sentencing reform, and to do it in a manner, as I said, that will stand the test of time. And with respect to the two private, the private members bill and the public members bill, I have had ongoing conversations with Senator Pate. I would welcome conversations with your colleague Sherry. These are considerations when those bills come before me that I will engage in discussions with my colleagues on.
Just as a follow-up then, you point out, I think, that some provinces Court of Appeal have upheld and some courts of appeal have not upheld mandatory minimums, creating essentially a patchwork system across our country for a law which is federal in nature, something that is really quite disturbing to a lot of lawyers who practice criminal law, that we would have such a patchwork develop. Isn't that yet another reason to move with expedition, as you said you would, so that we would have had, I thought you said, in 2017, reform efforts. Now we have private members' bills, Senate bills. We have a 300-page bill that doesn't even mention it. Isn't it important that we grapple with this in a more timely way, given the patchwork that's developed, as you indicated?
Well, again, in terms of sentencing reform, this is something that we are going to continue to review. This is a priority, as you say. It's in my mandate letter. I will consider the public and the private members' bills when they come before me and have discussions. And further, I would encourage this committee to, when Bill C-75 comes here, I would be very happy to continue to have this discussion around sentencing reform and hear what, if anything, the honourable members of this committee have to say with respect to what's in C-75 and perhaps what's not in C-75.